am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Midnight Echo. Remember,
The Corpse Beneath the Rose Arbor, a Miss Marple Mystery. By 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, the village of St. Mary Mead had acquired the peculiar air of a place where something was about to happen. Nothing in particular suggested it. The church clock had chimed 4 without interruption. Mrs. Pritchard's spaniel had barked at the postman in precisely the same tiresome fashion it did every afternoon. 2 boys had been sent home from the village green after an argument involving a cricket bat, a bicycle pump, and a rather indignant goose. And yet, beneath the ordinary sounds of village life, there was an expectancy. Perhaps it was the weather. The morning had been cool and overcast, but by lunchtime the clouds had drawn apart, revealing a pale blue sky. The late summer sun had warmed the stone walls and brought out the heavy perfume of the roses at Briarwood House. Perhaps it was the house itself. Briarwood stood at the edge of the village behind iron gates and a long gravel drive. It was not the grandest house in St. Mary Mead, nor even the oldest, but it possessed the sort of faded elegance that encouraged people to imagine things about it. There were stories, of course. There were always stories. Some concerned the previous owner, who had apparently lost a considerable amount of money on horses. Others concerned the present owner, Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt, who had lived at Briarwood for nearly 18 years and had never once been known to forgive an insult. Then there was the matter of her late husband, but that was considered old history. At least, that was what everyone said. On this particular Thursday, Mrs. Harcourt was giving a garden tea. It was intended to be a small affair. There were perhaps 25 guests, most of them residents of St. Mary Mead, or people connected with the village in one way or another. There were sandwiches arranged on silver trays, miniature cakes dusted with sugar, cucumber sandwiches with the crusts removed, and an alarming quantity of tea. At the far end of the garden stood the famous rose arbor. It was an old wooden structure, painted white many years ago, though the paint had since faded to a soft gray. Roses climbed over its roof in thick, tangled masses, deep crimson, pale pink, and one peculiar yellow variety that Mrs. Harcourt insisted had been cultivated especially for her. The arbor was large enough to contain a garden bench and a small stone table. It was also, as everyone knew, an excellent place for private conversations. And there had been several of those that afternoon. Miss Marple knew this because she had seen them. She sat beneath a striped parasol near the tea table, knitting something pale blue that appeared to be a scarf, but might equally have been intended for a doll. Her attention seemed entirely occupied by her knitting. It was not. Jane Marple had learned long ago that people behaved most naturally when they believed nobody was watching them. The person who knew she was being observed carefully arranged her face. The person who believed herself ignored revealed everything. So Miss Marple watched. She watched Mr. Charles Harcourt, the owner's nephew, standing near the lawn and pretending to listen to the vicar. She watched Miss Evelyn Price, the young secretary from Briarwood, who had laughed rather too loudly at something that was not particularly amusing. She watched Dr. Adrian Bell speaking to Mrs. Harcourt, and she watched Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt herself. The last was perhaps the most interesting. Mrs. Harcourt was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with silver blonde hair and the rigid posture of someone who had spent much of her life refusing to show weakness. She wore a dark green afternoon dress and a string of pearls. At first glance, she appeared perfectly composed. At second glance, she appeared angry. At third, she appeared frightened. Miss Marple noticed the difference. She also noticed that Mrs. Harcourt kept glancing toward the rose arbor. Not often, only every few minutes, but she did it. Lovely roses, aren't they? The voice beside Miss Marple belonged to Mrs. Agatha Simmons, who had been talking for several minutes about the shortcomings of modern gardeners. Very lovely, Miss Marple agreed. I always thought red roses were rather vulgar. Oh, I don't think so. No, though they can be. Mrs. Gurnhound. Simmons looked pleased. Exactly what I mean. Miss Marple smiled. A young man passed them carrying a tray of champagne. Mrs. Simmons lowered her voice. That's Charles Harcourt. Yes. Do you know, he has been asking his aunt for money again. Has he? Apparently. Miss Marple continued knitting. How unfortunate. More than unfortunate, dear. Financially desperate, I've heard. I see. And there's another thing. Mrs. Simmons leaned closer. Miss Marple looked up politely. Something about a letter. What sort of letter? I don't know. Ah. Which is precisely why it is interesting. Miss Marple smiled. Mrs. Simmons had always possessed a peculiar ability to treat ignorance as evidence. Before she could continue, a sudden burst of laughter came from the other side of the lawn. Everyone looked around. Mr. Charles Harcourt had apparently made a joke. Mrs. Harcourt did not laugh. She was looking toward him, then toward the rose arbor, then toward the house. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued to click softly. One stitch, then another, then another. At 4:05, Evelyn Price disappeared into the house. At 4:12, Dr. Bell followed her. At 4:17, Charles Harcourt walked toward the arbor. He remained there for approximately 3 minutes. When he returned, his face was pale. Miss Marple noticed. Nobody else did. At least, nobody appeared to. The afternoon continued. Tea was served. The vicar told a story about a bishop. Someone dropped a plate. A child chased a butterfly across the lawn, and Mrs. Harcourt suddenly announced that she had forgotten something in the house. She walked away quickly, too quickly. Miss Marple watched her disappear through the French doors. Then she looked toward the arbor. For the first time that afternoon, she stopped knitting. Something had changed. It was not something visible. It was a feeling, a tiny disturbance in the ordinary pattern of things. Miss Marple had learned that such disturbances were often more significant than dramatic events. A woman who normally spoke loudly lowered her voice. A man who always laughed stopped laughing. Someone who always arrived early arrived late. Someone who always looked directly at another person suddenly avoided their eyes. Human beings were creatures of habit, and habits, when broken, told stories. Jane. Miss Marple looked around. It was Reverend Leonard Peters. You seem distracted. Do I? Only slightly. She smiled. I was thinking about roses. Roses, yes, he laughed. Hardly dangerous things. No, said Miss Marple softly, not usually. At 4:30, Mrs. Harcourt returned. She was carrying a small silver key. Nobody seemed to notice, nobody except Miss Marple. The key was old-fashioned, attached to a thin black ribbon. Mrs. Harcourt slipped it into the pocket of her dress. Then she looked toward the arbor again. This time her expression was unmistakable. Fear. A minute later, a scream came from the garden. It was not a woman's scream, it was a man's. Every conversation stopped. The guests turned toward the rose arbor. Charles Harcourt was standing several yards away from it. His face had gone white. There's someone under there, he said. Nobody moved. The vicar was the first to speak. Someone, Charles swallowed. I thought it was a bundle of old gardening cloth. His voice trembled. Then I saw the hand. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then everyone began talking at once. Mrs. Simmons gasped. Someone shouted for the gardener. Dr. Bell pushed through the gathering crowd. Mrs. Harcourt stood perfectly still, and Miss Marple remained seated beneath the parasol. Only her hands had stopped moving. Nobody touch anything, Dr. Bell ordered. But it was already too late. The garden had begun to fill with people. The rose arbor stood at the center of them all, its crimson flowers glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Beneath those roses, partially hidden by weeds and fallen petals, lay the body of a man. His face could not yet be seen, but one hand was visible. A gold signet ring gleamed on the little finger. Miss Marple looked at it. Then she looked at Mrs. Harcourt. The widow had stopped breathing, only for a second, but Miss Marple saw it. And curiously, she did not look surprised. She looked disappointed, as though something she had hoped would never happen had finally happened after all. The police would soon arrive. There would be questions. There would be accusations. There would be explanations. And before the evening was over, St. Mary Mead would have chosen its murderer. But Miss Marple knew something the others did not. The dead man had not merely been hidden beneath the roses. Someone had expected him to remain hidden. And that, she thought, was quite a different matter. She picked up her knitting. The pale blue wool trembled once between her fingers. Then she began to knit again. For nearly a minute after Charles Harcourt had spoken, nobody moved. The garden seemed to have become strangely still, as though even the birds had understood that something terrible had interrupted the pleasant afternoon. The body beneath the rose arbor remained partly concealed by the thick foliage, its dark coat visible between trailing stems and fallen petals, while the guests stood in a loose semicircle several yards away, each person looking at the others rather than at the corpse. It was a curious instinct, Miss Marple thought. People were often less afraid of death itself than of discovering that someone standing beside them might have had something to do with it. Dr. Adrian Bell pushed through the crowd and approached the arbor carefully, raising one hand to prevent anyone from following him. "Please remain where you are," he said firmly. "Nobody is to touch anything." His voice had acquired the professional calm that doctors sometimes used when they were most disturbed. He crouched near the body without touching it, studying what little could be seen. A moment later he straightened. "He's dead." Mrs. Simmons gave a small cry. "Oh, surely you don't mean—" "I'm afraid so." "But who is he?" someone asked. No one answered. Miss Marple remained beneath the parasol, her hands folded neatly over her knitting. She had no desire to approach the body. Dead men, she had always felt, had very little more to say. The living were considerably more interesting, and the living at that moment were speaking volumes. Mrs. Harcourt stood beside the French doors, one hand pressed against the frame. She appeared composed again, but Miss Marple noticed that she had turned slightly away from everyone. Charles Harcourt, meanwhile, had begun explaining himself before anyone had actually accused him of anything. "I didn't kill him," he said. "Good heavens, Charles," Mrs. Simmons exclaimed. "Nobody said you had. I found him, that's all." "You said you thought it was gardening cloth," Reverend Peters reminded him. "Yes." Charles swallowed. "I saw something beneath the roses. I thought perhaps the gardener had left a sack there. Then I noticed the hand." "What were you doing at the arbor?" Dr. Bell asked. Charles looked irritated. "I went there for some air." "For 3 minutes," Miss Evelyn Price suddenly said. Everyone turned toward her. The young secretary had come out of the house and was standing near the terrace steps. Her face was pale, and there was a small smear of dust on the sleeve of her cream-colored dress. Charles stared at her. "What does that mean?" "Nothing. You said 3 minutes." Evelyn seemed to realize she had spoken too quickly. "I only meant that you were there for some time." Charles's expression hardened. "Were you watching me?" "No." "Then how would you know?" Evelyn said nothing. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her knitting. The conversation was becoming interesting, very interesting indeed. It was not Charles's anger that caught her attention. It was Evelyn's hands. The young woman was twisting the edge of her handkerchief repeatedly, but only with her left hand. Her right hand remained perfectly still. People usually used both hands when nervous, unless, of course, one hand was hiding something. Miss Marple looked away. She had no intention of making an accusation based upon a handkerchief. One must never mistake an observation for a conclusion. That was a common mistake among amateur detectives. The police arrived at Briarwood 22 minutes later. Inspector William Graves was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with thinning gray hair and the patient expression of someone who had spent many years listening to people lie badly. He was accompanied by Sergeant Miles Carter, a younger officer who carried a notebook and looked as though he would much rather be anywhere else. Inspector Graves entered the garden, spoke briefly to Dr. Bell, and then examined the area around the arbor. His eyes moved over the guests. "Who discovered the body?" "I did," Charles replied. "Mr. Harcourt, stay where you are." Charles obeyed. Graves crouched near the arbor, examined the ground, and then looked toward the house. "Mrs. Harcourt?" "Yes. Would you come inside with me, please?" Lavinia Harcourt nodded. Before she moved, however, she glanced toward Miss Marple. Their eyes met for only a second. There was something in that glance which Miss Marple could not quite identify. Not a request for help. Not exactly. It was more like recognition, as though Mrs. Harcourt knew that Miss Marple had noticed something. Then she followed the inspector indoors. The guests remained in the garden, trapped together by circumstance and curiosity. Within 5 minutes, the whispering began. It started with Mrs. Simmons. I believe he was connected with the Harcourts. "Who?" "The dead man. How do you know? I don't, but one can tell. Tell what? That sort of thing. Miss Marple heard the exchange and smiled faintly. People rarely needed facts when they had a theory. By 6 o'clock, St. Mary Mead had already produced 3 possible identities for the corpse. One theory suggested that he was a businessman connected to Mrs. Harcourt. Another claimed he was an old friend of her late husband. A third, considerably more imaginative, suggested that he was a blackmailer. The last theory spread fastest. Miss Marple was not surprised. Blackmail was one of those crimes people found enormously attractive because it made every secret look important. Eventually, Inspector Graves returned to the garden. "We have identified the deceased," he announced. The murmuring stopped. His name was Edward Ashcombe. Mrs. Harcourt, who had just emerged from the house, went completely still. It was only for a fraction of a second, but Miss Marple saw it. Charles saw it too. Evelyn did not, or pretended not to. Inspector Graves continued. Mr. Ashcombe was 57 years old. He was formerly employed by a London investment firm. He had known Mrs. Harcourt for several years. "How many?" Charles asked. Graves looked at him. "That's something we'll establish. Was he a friend of my aunt?" "I didn't say that." Charles's face tightened. "Then what was he?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." A silence followed. Dr. Bell folded his arms. "How did he die?" he asked. "At present we don't know." Graves looked toward the arbor. "There are no obvious signs of a struggle. We will know more after the examination." "Could he have died naturally?" Reverend Peters asked, "and then been placed beneath the roses?" Graves considered him. "It's possible, but I wouldn't make assumptions yet." Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Harcourt had turned her head away. She was looking toward the lawn, not at the arbor, not at the inspector, toward the empty chair where she had been sitting earlier. On that chair lay a small silver teaspoon. Miss Marple remembered seeing Mrs. Harcourt holding it during tea. Why had she left it there? It was such a small thing that nobody else would notice. Miss Marple did not attach importance to the spoon itself. She attached importance to the fact that Mrs. Harcourt had been very particular about her belongings throughout the afternoon. A woman who disliked disorder did not casually leave a silver spoon on a garden chair, unless she had been distracted, or frightened, or both. Inspector Graves began taking statements. Mrs. Simmons was delighted to be questioned, and provided far more information than anyone had requested. She described the weather, the sandwiches, the roses, the behavior of Charles Harcourt, the history of Briarwood House, and finally, after considerable encouragement, what she actually knew about Edward Ashcombe. "I saw him once before," she said, "about 2 months ago." "Where?" "Here." "At Briarwood?" "Yes. He came to see Mrs. Harcourt." "How do you know?" "Because I saw his car." Graves sighed quietly. "Did you see Mr. Ashcombe himself?" "Through the upstairs window." "And you recognized him?" "Not exactly." "Then how do you know it was him?" Mrs. Simmons looked offended. "I have eyes, Inspector." Miss Marple almost smiled. Inspector Graves moved on. When he reached Miss Marple, he removed his cap and gave her a polite nod. "Miss Marple." "Inspector, I understand you were here for most of the afternoon." "Yes. Did you see anything unusual?" Miss Marple paused. "That depends upon what you mean by unusual." Graves smiled slightly. "Anything that seemed out of place?" "Well," she glanced toward the rose arbor. "Mr. Harcourt went there shortly before the body was discovered." Charles, standing nearby, looked sharply at her. "I already told you that," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But you didn't tell me that Miss Price noticed how long you were there." Charles stared at her. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Inspector Graves made a note. "Anything else?" Mrs. Harcourt looked toward the arbor several times. The widow's face changed. "I was concerned about the roses," she said quickly. Miss Marple smiled. "Of course." Inspector Graves looked between them. "And you, Miss Marple, did you notice anyone else near the arbor?" Miss Marple considered the question. She could have mentioned Dr. Bell. She could have mentioned Evelyn. She could have mentioned the brief moment when Mrs. Harcourt had disappeared into the house. But something held her back. Not suspicion, caution. "I noticed several people moving about," she said. I'm afraid I couldn't say precisely who went where. Graves studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well. He moved away. Miss Marple resumed knitting. The evening light had begun to fade, and the roses no longer looked cheerful. They looked dark and heavy, their petals almost black in the shadows beneath the arbor. Suddenly Evelyn Price approached her. "Miss Marple?" "Yes, dear?" Evelyn hesitated. "May I ask you something?" "Certainly." The girl glanced toward the house. "Did you really see Mrs. Harcourt looking at the arbor?" "Yes." "How many times?" Miss Marple looked at her carefully. "Several." Evelyn's fingers tightened around her handkerchief. "She was expecting someone," she whispered. "Were you?" Miss Marple asked. Evelyn looked startled. "No." "Then why did you say that?" The young woman opened her mouth but did not answer. Somewhere behind them, Inspector Graves called for Sergeant Carter. Evelyn looked toward the sound. "There was a letter," she said suddenly. "What sort of letter?" "I don't know." "Where is it?" Evelyn's face went pale. It disappeared. Before Miss Marple could ask another question, Evelyn turned and hurried toward the house. Miss Marple watched her go. A letter. A missing letter. A dead man beneath a rose arbor. A frightened widow. A nephew with financial troubles. A secretary who knew more than she wished to admit. And somewhere among them was a person who had already begun lying. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. One stitch, then another. She thought of something Mrs. Harcourt had done earlier that afternoon. Something so insignificant that nobody else could possibly have remembered it. When the silver key had slipped into the widow's pocket, Mrs. Harcourt had touched it twice, not to check that it was there, to make certain that it was still locked. Miss Marple's expression became thoughtful. The rose arbor, she decided, was not the beginning of the mystery. It was merely where someone had chosen to leave its first visible consequence. By 7 o'clock that evening, Briarwood House no longer resembled the cheerful country residence it had been only 3 hours earlier. The garden tables had been abandoned, the half-empty teacups stood untouched upon silver trays, and the roses beneath the arbor had become a silent center of attention. Police officers moved carefully across the lawn, speaking in low voices and examining places which, earlier that afternoon, had seemed too ordinary to deserve a second glance. The guests had been asked to remain until their statements were taken, though several had already been permitted to leave, provided they remained available to the police. Miss Marple was among those still waiting. She sat in the drawing room beside the tall window, her knitting resting neatly in her lap. Outside, the last light of evening had turned the lawn a dull green, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the grass like long fingers. Miss Marple had always found that houses changed after a death. It was not merely that people became quieter. Rooms themselves seemed to lose their ordinary purpose. A drawing room was no longer a drawing room when a murder had occurred nearby. It became a place where people remembered what they had said, what they had seen, and what they desperately hoped nobody else had noticed. Inspector Graves entered the room carrying a small notebook. "Miss Marple, may I ask you a few more questions?" "Of course." He sat opposite her. "You mentioned earlier that Mrs. Harcourt repeatedly looked toward the rose arbor." "Yes." "Can you tell me why?" "No." "Did she appear frightened?" Miss Marple considered this. "Once or twice." "Once or twice?" Her expression changed. It was not constant. Graves leaned back. "What about Mr. Charles Harcourt?" "He seemed upset." "He was the man who found the body." "Yes." "And he had financial difficulties?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People have been saying so. I'm asking what you observed." "I observed that he was anxious when Mrs. Harcourt spoke to him." "When did that happen?" "Just before tea." Graves immediately wrote something down. "What did they discuss?" "I couldn't hear." "But you saw them together?" "Yes." "And afterwards?" "Mr. Harcourt went to the rose arbor, alone, as far as I know." Graves closed his notebook for a moment. "Miss Marple, you have lived in St. Mary Mead for a long time. You know how people behave. If you had to name the person you found most suspicious this afternoon, who would it be?" Miss Marple looked genuinely troubled by the question. "Oh, Inspector, that would be terribly unfair." "Why?" "Because suspicious people are not necessarily murderers. And murderers aren't necessarily suspicious." Exactly. Graves smiled despite himself. Very well. Let me put it differently. Who was behaving unusually? Miss Marple lowered her eyes to the knitting. Miss Price. The inspector's expression sharpened. Why? She was frightened. Of the body? No. How can you tell? Miss Marple looked up. She was frightened before the body was discovered. Graves remained silent for several seconds. Did she know Edward Ashcombe? I don't know. Did she speak to him today? I didn't see her. But you suspect she did. I didn't say that. Graves gave a small sigh. You are very careful. At my age, one learns that certainty is a dangerous luxury. The inspector stood. Thank you, Miss Marple. He turned toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Did you see Mrs. Harcourt carrying anything unusual? Miss Marple thought about the silver key. She had a key. What kind? An old-fashioned one. Did you see where she put it? In her dress pocket. Graves nodded and left. Miss Marple watched the door close behind him. Then she resumed knitting. She had not mentioned the way Mrs. Harcourt had touched the key twice. Some things were better kept in one's mind until one understood their meaning. In the hallway, a door opened. Evelyn Price stepped into the drawing room. She looked exhausted. Miss Marple. Yes, dear. May I sit with you? Certainly. Evelyn sat on the edge of a chair. For several seconds she said nothing. Her face looked younger than it had in the garden. Without the careful composure she had worn earlier, she seemed almost fragile. Inspector Graves asked me about the letter, she said finally. Did he? Yes. And what did you tell him? Evelyn stared at the carpet. That I had seen it. Where? In Mrs. Harcourt's study. Miss Marple continued knitting. When? This morning. What was unusual about it? Evelyn hesitated. It was addressed to Mrs. Harcourt. From Mr. Ashcombe. Yes. How do you know? I recognized the handwriting. Miss Marple's needle stopped. You knew his handwriting. I had seen it before. Where? Evelyn looked toward the window. On business letters. Mind when Benham. What business did Mr. Ashcombe have with Mrs. Harcourt? I don't know. You were her secretary. Yes. Surely you would have known. Evelyn gave a bitter little laugh. Mrs. Harcourt didn't tell me everything. No, Miss Marple agreed. People rarely do. Evelyn lowered her voice. The letter said he intended to come today. At what time? It didn't say. And where is the letter now? I don't know. You said it disappeared. It was on her desk when I left the study. When was that? Just before lunch. And when did you next see Mrs. Harcourt? At the garden tea. Then perhaps she removed it. Perhaps. Evelyn looked nervous again. But I don't think she did. Why? Because Mrs. Harcourt was waiting for him. Miss Marple looked at her. How do you know? Evelyn swallowed. Because I heard her say his name. When? This afternoon. In the hallway. To whom? To Mr. Charles. Miss Marple's eyes became thoughtful. And what did she say? She said, Edward must not be allowed to speak. A silence followed. Are you certain? Yes. What did Charles say? I couldn't hear. And after that, Mrs. Harcourt told me to return to the garden. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Did she seem frightened? No. Evelyn paused. She seemed angry. That distinction interested Miss Marple. Fear made people unpredictable. Anger, however, often revealed intention. Before she could continue, the drawing-room door opened again. Charles Harcourt entered. He looked directly at Evelyn. What are you doing here? Talking to Miss Marple. About what? Evelyn stood. Nothing. Charles stepped closer. You should be careful, Evelyn. Miss Marple looked up. Careful of what, Mr. Harcourt? He seemed surprised by the question. I only meant that the police are asking questions. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. They usually do after a murder. Charles's jaw tightened. I have nothing to hide. I'm sure that's comforting. He stared at her for a moment, uncertain whether she was being sincere. Then he turned to Evelyn. Aunt Lavinia wants you. Where is she? In the study. Evelyn left immediately. Charles remained behind. Miss Marple watched him. You seem troubled. I found a dead man in the garden. That would trouble most people. You think I killed him? No. Charles looked almost relieved. Then you believe me? I didn't say that either. He frowned. Miss Marple smiled. You see, Mr. Harcourt, there are many possibilities. The police think I had something to do with it. Do they? They keep asking about money. Were you in financial difficulty? Charles hesitated. Yes. And did you owe your aunt money? Yes. Did Mr. Ashcombe know about it? Charles looked sharply at her. How did you know that? Miss Marple smiled. I didn't. You have just told me. He seemed annoyed with himself. Ashcombe was threatening me. There it was. A motive, or something that looked very much like one. Why? Miss Marple asked. Charles glanced toward the door. Because he knew about something I had done. Something illegal. No? Immoral? Charles gave a bitter laugh. In St. Mary Mead, that's practically the same thing. Miss Marple waited. I invested some of my aunt's money without permission, he said. I lost it. How much? Enough. And Mr. Ashcombe knew. Yes. Did he threaten to tell her? He said he would. When? A few days ago. Arbor. Then you had reason to fear him. Charles stared at the floor. Yes. And you went to the Arbor this afternoon. Yes. Why? I thought Ashcombe had left something there. What? A letter. Miss Marple looked up. A letter? He told me he'd hidden something near the Arbor. Did you find it? Charles shook his head. No. Then what did you find? His face changed. The body. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Did you touch it? No. Did you touch anything near it? No. Are you sure? Charles looked offended. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. Good. He turned to leave. Mr. Harcourt. He stopped. Yes? What did Mr. Ashcombe know about your aunt? Charles's face became completely blank. Nothing. Are you certain? Yes. He left. Miss Marple sat very still. Nothing, she thought, was often the most interesting answer of all. A few minutes later, the door opened and Mrs. Harcourt entered. She had changed her dress. The green afternoon gown had been replaced by a dark blue one, and her silver hair had been rearranged. She looked composed again. Miss Marple, Lavinia, I understand the police have been questioning you. They have. You told them about the key? Yes. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes narrowed slightly. What else did you tell them? Only what I observed. And what did you observe? Miss Marple smiled. That is rather a broad question. Mrs. Harcourt came closer. Jane, we have known each other for many years. I am asking you as a friend. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Of course. Did you see Edward Ashcombe today? No. Did you see him arrive? No. Then you cannot possibly know anything about what happened. That is true. Mrs. Harcourt seemed relieved. Good. She turned away. Miss Marple watched her reflection in the darkened window. Lavinia? The woman stopped. Yes. What did the letter say? Mrs. Harcourt did not move. For 3 seconds she remained perfectly still. Then she turned. What letter? Miss Marple smiled gently. The one Mr. Ashcombe sent you. Mrs. Harcourt's face had become pale. I received no letter. Miss Marple said nothing. Mrs. Harcourt walked toward the door. Before she reached it, Miss Marple spoke again. How unfortunate. The widow stopped. What is? That it has disappeared. Mrs. Harcourt looked back. I don't know what you mean. No, said Miss Marple softly. I don't suppose you do. The door closed. Miss Marple remained alone. Outside, the garden had become completely dark. Somewhere beyond the window, an owl called once, and then fell silent. Miss Marple looked toward the rose arbor, barely visible in the distance. The dead man had carried a secret into Briarwood House. A letter had been written. A letter had disappeared. Charles had a motive. Evelyn had knowledge. Mrs. Harcourt had lied, yet something was wrong. The obvious explanation was beginning to appear almost too obvious. Miss Marple had seen it many times before. When people committed crimes, they often behaved exactly as one expected a guilty person to behave. But there was another sort of person, the person who wanted everyone to believe they were guilty. That person was much more dangerous. She picked up her knitting again and carefully inserted the needle into the next stitch. How very clever. she murmured, but not quite clever enough. And for the first time that evening, Miss Marple wondered whether the body beneath the roses had been placed there to conceal the identity of the murderer, or to reveal it. The following morning, Briarwood House woke beneath a grey sky and a silence that seemed heavier than the weather warranted. The police had remained at the house throughout the night, and by breakfast time the servants had already learned that nothing in the household would ever again feel quite as ordinary as it had 24 hours earlier. The body of Edward Ashcombe had been removed shortly after midnight, but his presence seemed to linger in every room. There were whispers in the kitchen, cautious footsteps in the corridor, and doors that closed more quietly than usual. Mrs. Harcourt had not slept. She had spent most of the night in her bedroom, refusing dinner and speaking to no one except Inspector Graves. At 8 o'clock she finally came downstairs and entered the breakfast room, where Charles Harcourt was already sitting with a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. Evelyn Price stood beside the sideboard sorting correspondence. Neither looked at the other. "Good morning," Mrs. Harcourt said. Nobody answered immediately. Then Charles murmured, "Morning." Mrs. Harcourt sat down. Her eyes moved toward the chair opposite her, where Edward Ashcombe might once have sat during some previous visit. For a moment she seemed lost in thought. Then she straightened. "Charles, Inspector Graves wants to speak to you again." "I know." He asked whether you knew where Edward had been staying. Charles looked up sharply. "No. You told him that yesterday." "Because it's true." "Then why is he asking again?" "Because he's the police." Mrs. Harcourt's mouth tightened. "Don't be clever with me." Charles laughed without amusement. "That's rich." Evelyn glanced up. "Perhaps you should both stop." Mrs. Harcourt turned toward her. "You weren't asked to speak." Evelyn lowered her eyes. The room became silent again. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had arrived at Briarwood shortly after 9. She had been invited by Mrs. Harcourt to come for tea that afternoon, but under the circumstances she had considered it more useful to arrive early. Inspector Graves was waiting for her in the entrance hall. "You do seem to have a talent for appearing at inconvenient moments, Miss Marple." "I have often found that inconvenient moments are the most informative." Graves smiled. "Come through." He led her into the library. Several papers had been spread across the desk. "We've learned more about Ashcombe." "Have you?" "Yes. He had been in the village for 3 days. Miss Marple looked surprised. 3 days? Apparently he stayed at the Bell and Crown. How interesting. You say that as though you expected it. Not at all. Graves watched her carefully. He registered under his own name. The innkeeper remembered him. He spent most of his time away from the inn. Where did he go? Here. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Briarwood. At least twice before yesterday. Did anyone see him? Mrs. Harcourt's gardener claims he did. Claims? Yes. He says Ashcombe spoke to him near the gate on Tuesday. What did they discuss? The gardener says he doesn't remember. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That sounds convenient. Graves nodded. Very. He handed her a sheet of paper. There's more. Ashcombe withdrew a considerable amount of cash from his bank 2 days ago. How much? Enough to make it significant. And did he spend it? We don't know. Miss Marple looked at the document. Was any money found on him? Very little. Then someone may have taken it. That's one possibility. Or he gave it to someone. Graves looked pleased. That's what I thought you'd say. Miss Marple returned the paper. What about the letter? Still missing. And Mrs. Harcourt? Still insisting she never received one. Miss Marple's expression remained neutral. Does Inspector Graves believe her? No. Does he believe Charles? Even less. Miss Marple smiled. Then perhaps we should consider the possibility that both are telling portions of the truth. Graves stared at her. What do you mean? People seldom lie about everything. She glanced toward the library door. Sometimes the truth is hidden inside the lie. Before Graves could answer, the door opened and Sergeant Carter entered. Inspector, we've found something. He held a small evidence bag. Inside was a brass key. Miss Marple's eyes moved immediately to it. Where? Graves asked. In the gardener's shed. Where exactly? Inside an old tool chest. Graves took the bag. Who has access to the shed? The gardener, obviously. Mrs. Harcourt. Charles. Possibly Miss Price. And the servants. The maid has a key. Miss Marple leaned closer without touching the bag. What does the key open? Carter shook his head. We don't know. Miss Marple looked at the shape of it. It is not a house key. Graves nodded. We're checking. Perhaps it belongs to the Arbor. Carter looked puzzled. The Arbor. There may be a small lock somewhere. Graves considered the idea. We'll have someone inspect it. The three of them walked outside. The morning air smelled of wet grass. The rose arbor looked completely different under the gray daylight. Its romantic beauty had vanished, leaving only tangled branches and old wood. A police officer was examining the ground nearby. There, Carter said, a small iron box was fixed beneath the bench. It had been almost completely hidden by ivy. Graves knelt. The brass key fitted the lock perfectly. When he turned it, the box opened with a soft metallic click. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a silver cigarette case, and a photograph. Miss Marple did not touch anything. She looked at the photograph instead. It showed a much younger Mrs. Harcourt standing beside a man Miss Marple recognized immediately as Edward Ashcombe. But there was another person in the picture. A young woman stood behind them, half smiling at the camera. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She knew that face. Who is she? Graves asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. I believe, she said slowly, that we should ask Mrs. Harcourt. When the photograph was shown to Lavinia Harcourt, she became visibly angry. Where did you find this? In a locked box beneath the arbor. Mrs. Harcourt stared at the photograph. I had forgotten about it. Who is the young woman? Her name was Marianne Cole. Was? She died. When? 24 years ago. Charles had entered the room while they were speaking. He froze at the name. Miss Marple noticed immediately. You know her? Graves asked. Charles shook his head. No. Then why did you react? I didn't. You did, Miss Marple said gently. Charles glared at her. You people see things that aren't there. Sometimes, Miss Marple agreed, but not always. Mrs. Harcourt took the photograph from the inspector's hand. This is irrelevant. Is it? Graves asked. Marianne Cole was your husband's secretary, wasn't she? Mrs. Harcourt's expression hardened. Yes. And she died shortly after leaving Briarwood. Yes. How? An accident. Miss Marple watched her carefully. What sort of accident? Mrs. Harcourt looked toward the window. She fell from a railway platform. 24 years ago. Yes. And Edward Ashcombe knew her. Yes. Did he know how she died? Of course. Was he responsible? Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flashed. No. The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. So did Graves. Nobody accused him, the inspector said. Mrs. Harcourt realized her mistake. I simply meant, I understand. Graves folded his arms. Why was the photograph hidden? I don't know. It was in your garden. I said I don't know. Miss Marple looked at the photograph. There was something strange about it. Edward Ashcombe stood slightly apart from the others. His expression was not cheerful. He looked directly at the camera, but his eyes seemed fixed on something beyond it. Marianne Cole stood behind him. Mrs. Harcourt stood beside him. 3 people, 3 different expressions, 1 secret. Later, Miss Marple found Evelyn alone in the conservatory. The young woman was arranging flowers that did not need arranging. Marianne Cole, Miss Marple said. Evelyn's hands stopped. What about her? You know the name. Everyone does now. Did you know it before yesterday? Evelyn hesitated. Yes. How? Mrs. Harcourt mentioned her once. When? Several months ago. Why? I don't remember. Miss Marple smiled gently. You do. Evelyn looked away. She asked me to find some old papers. About Marianne. Yes. Did you find them? Some. And most were missing. Who had removed them? Evelyn shook her head. I don't know. Miss Marple studied her. You are frightened, dear. I'm not. You are. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. If I tell you something, will you promise not to tell Inspector Graves? Miss Marple considered this. I cannot promise that. Then I can't. Very well. Evelyn turned away. After a long silence, she said, There was another letter. Miss Marple waited. From Edward Ashcombe. When? Last week. To whom? Mrs. Harcourt. What did it say? I didn't read it. But you know there was one. I delivered it. And what happened afterward? Evelyn's voice dropped. Mrs. Harcourt burned it. Miss Marple's eyes remained on her. Are you certain? I saw the fire. Where? In the study fireplace. When? Last Friday. Did you see what was written? Only one sentence. What sentence? Evelyn swallowed. It said, 24 years is a long time to keep a secret. Miss Marple was silent. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the conservatory glass. Did Mrs. Harcourt know what it meant? Yes. How do you know? Because after she read it, she said something. What? Evelyn looked toward the door before answering. She said, he promised never to come back. Miss Marple's face remained calm, but something had changed in her eyes. Edward Ashcombe had not arrived in St. Mary Mead by accident. He had returned because of something that had happened 24 years earlier. Mary Ann Cole had died, a letter had been burned, another letter had disappeared, and now Edward Ashcombe was dead beneath the roses. That afternoon, Inspector Graves received a new report. The medical examination had revealed that Ashcombe had not died beneath the arbor. He had been dead for several hours before his body was placed there. This meant that someone had moved him. More importantly, the time of death placed the murder before the garden party had properly begun. Miss Marple listened quietly as Graves explained. So whoever killed him had access to Briarwood before the guests arrived, she said. Yes, and they knew exactly where to put him. Yes, which means they knew the garden well. Graves nodded, and probably the house. Miss Marple looked toward the window, or they knew someone who did. At that moment, a servant hurried into the room. Inspector, Mrs. Harcourt has disappeared. Graves stood immediately. What? Her bedroom is empty. Her coat is gone. Miss Marple rose slowly. Where is Charles? We don't know. And Miss Price? She was in the library. Miss Marple looked at Graves. Then I think, she said quietly, that we should find Mrs. Harcourt before someone else does. The inspector grabbed his coat. Outside, the rain had begun to fall heavily over Briarwood. The roses bent beneath the weight of the water, their petals scattering across the ground. One red petal landed upon the place where Edward Ashcombe's body had been found. Miss Marple watched it for a moment. 24 years, she thought. People believed that time buried secrets. It did not. Time merely taught people how to hide them better. The rain had become heavier by the time Inspector Graves reached the front hall, and the windows of Briarwood House rattled softly beneath the force of the wind. Mrs. Harcourt had disappeared without taking an umbrella, which was the first thing that troubled Miss Marple. A woman as careful about appearances as Lavinia Harcourt would not ordinarily step into a storm without one. Nor would she leave the house wearing only a dark wool coat when the roads beyond Briarwood were already becoming flooded with rainwater. There were other things that troubled Miss Marple as well. The bedroom had been empty, the coat had disappeared, but the servants had heard no front door open. The back door, however, stood unlocked. Inspector Graves moved quickly toward it, followed by Sergeant Carter and Charles Harcourt, who had appeared from the library with an expression of alarm that was perhaps too genuine to be entirely comfortable. When did anyone last see her? Graves asked. I did, Charles said, about 20 minutes ago. Where? In the hall. What did she say? Nothing. Did she seem frightened? Charles hesitated. Yes. Miss Marple watched him closely. What did she do? She asked me whether I had spoken to the police about Edward. And what did you say? I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't told them everything. Graves looked sharply at him. What haven't you told us? Charles looked toward Miss Marple, then back at the inspector. I found something yesterday. What? A piece of paper. Where? Near the arbor. And you didn't think it worth mentioning? I didn't know what it meant. You could have mentioned it. I was afraid. Graves stepped closer. Afraid of what? Charles looked toward the rain-darkened garden. Of my aunt. Miss Marple said nothing. Charles reached into his jacket and removed a folded scrap of paper. It was old and slightly torn, with one corner stained brown. He handed it to Graves. The inspector unfolded it carefully. There were only 6 words written across it in faded black ink. She saw everything that night. Graves read the sentence twice. Whose handwriting? Charles shook his head. I don't know. Where exactly did you find it? Under the bench. Miss Marple looked toward the arbor through the open doorway. And you kept it? Yes. Why? Charles looked embarrassed. Because I thought it might clear me. Or implicate someone else, Graves said. Charles did not answer. Miss Marple approached the inspector. May I see it? Graves handed her the paper. She examined it without touching the ink. The writing was cramped and hurried. The word everything had been written with unusual pressure, while the final word seemed almost faded. Miss Marple's eyes remained on the paper. This was written recently, she said. Graves looked surprised. How can you tell? The paper is old, but the ink isn't. You can tell that? Not precisely, but the pressure is different, she pointed gently. Whoever wrote this was angry. Charles stared at her. Could it have been Edward? Possibly. Could it have been my aunt? Possibly. Could it have been Evelyn? Possibly. Miss Marple smiled. There are many possibilities. Graves took the paper back. What does she saw everything mean? Nobody answered. Then Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She had heard enough to understand the significance. Her face had gone pale. I know, she said. Everyone turned toward her. Know what? Graves asked. Evelyn stepped inside. Who she was? Who? The woman who saw everything. Miss Marple's expression became very still. Evelyn looked toward Charles. Marianne Cole. Charles frowned. But she died 24 years ago. Yes. Then how could she have seen anything yesterday? She couldn't. Evelyn swallowed. The note wasn't talking about yesterday. Silence filled the hall. Inspector Graves lowered his voice. Start at the beginning. Evelyn looked frightened. 24 years ago, before Marianne died, she discovered something about Mr. Harcourt. Lavinia's husband. Yes. What? I don't know exactly. You don't know? No. But I found something in the old files. What files? The Briarwood accounts. Charles looked confused. What do the accounts have to do with Marianne? Evelyn glanced toward him. Money was missing. Charles's expression changed. How much? A lot. Who took it? I don't know. But Marianne knew. I think so. Graves folded his arms. And Edward Ashcombe. He knew too. Miss Marple quietly interrupted. Did Edward know Marianne had discovered the missing money? Evelyn nodded. Then perhaps Marianne's death was not an accident. No one spoke. The rain continued against the windows. Charles finally said, Are you saying my uncle murdered her? I didn't say that, Miss Marple replied. I'm saying that the past may be connected to the present. Graves turned toward Evelyn. Why didn't you tell us this yesterday? Because I was afraid. Of whom? Evelyn looked at the staircase. Everyone. Graves followed her gaze. Why? Because somebody has been going through my room. Charles stared at her. What? Yesterday morning, I found my desk drawers open. Perhaps you left them that way. I didn't. What was missing? Evelyn hesitated. Nothing. Miss Marple smiled gently. Then perhaps someone was looking rather than taking. Evelyn nodded. That is what I thought. Graves immediately ordered Sergeant Carter to inspect Evelyn's room. While the officer went upstairs, Miss Marple remained near the door. She was thinking about the 6 words on the paper. She saw everything that night. If Marianne had seen everything, then someone had spent 24 years worrying about what she might have revealed. Yet Marianne was dead. Unless, Miss Marple thought, the sentence referred not to Marianne, but to another woman. A woman who had been alive 24 years ago. A woman who had been present at the event. A woman who might still be alive. She looked toward the portrait hanging above the fireplace. It showed Mrs. Harcourt's late husband, Henry Harcourt, standing beside a younger Lavinia. Behind them, barely visible through the garden trees, stood another figure. Miss Marple moved closer. It was Marianne Cole. She had been in the garden when the photograph was taken, but there was something else. Near Marianne's hand was a small metal object hanging from a chain, a key, the same shape as the key Mrs. Harcourt had carried yesterday. Miss Marple felt a quiet chill. Inspector, Graves turned. Yes? When did Marianne leave Briarwood? according to the records, 3 days before her death. And who was with her? Graves checked his notes. Nobody. Are you certain? That's what the file says. Miss Marple looked at the photograph again. Files can be wrong. Before Graves could respond, Sergeant Carter hurried downstairs. Inspector, you should see this. He held a small envelope. Found under the mattress in Miss Price's room. Evelyn stared at it. That's not mine. We didn't say it was. Graves opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a photograph. This one was much older. It showed the railway platform where Marianne Cole had supposedly died. There were several people visible in the background. One of them was unmistakably Henry Harcourt. Another was Edward Ashcombe, and a third person stood beside the station clock, partially obscured by shadow. Miss Marple leaned closer. "Who is that?" Graves asked. Nobody knew. Charles looked at the photograph and shook his head. "I've never seen that person before," Evelyn whispered. "I have." Everyone turned toward her. "Where?" "In the village." "Who is it?" Evelyn's face had become almost colorless. "Mrs. Bell." Graves frowned. "Doctor Bell's wife?" Evelyn nodded. "She used to work here." Miss Marple looked at her. "When?" 24 years ago." The room seemed to grow colder. "What was her name?" Graves asked. "Clara Bell." Miss Marple looked toward the staircase. Dr. Adrian Bell had been one of the guests at the garden party. He had been one of the first people to examine Edward Ashcombe's body. He had also known Mrs. Harcourt for many years, and now his dead wife's name had appeared in connection with Marianne Cole. Graves immediately sent Carter to find Dr. Bell. But before the sergeant could leave, the telephone rang. It was the local station, the inspector answered. His expression changed several times while he listened. Finally he said, "Understood. We'll come immediately." He put the receiver down. "Ashcombe's room at the Bell and Crown has been searched." "And?" Charles asked. "They found blood on a handkerchief." Evelyn covered her mouth. "Whose blood?" Graves looked at her. "That's what we don't know yet." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Where was the handkerchief?" "Inside a locked suitcase." "Whose suitcase?" "Edward Ashcombe's." Charles looked relieved for a moment, but Miss Marple did not share his relief. A handkerchief containing blood, hidden inside the dead man's own suitcase, seemed almost too convenient. Someone wanted the police to find it. And when someone wanted the police to find something, Miss Marple had learned, one must ask why. "Inspector," she said softly, "did the suitcase show any sign of having been opened recently?" "Yes." "Then perhaps the handkerchief was planted." Graves stared at her. "You think someone went into Ashcombe's room after his death?" "I think someone wanted us to believe they did." Before Graves could answer, there was a sudden sound from upstairs. A door slammed. Everyone looked toward the staircase. Then came the sound of footsteps running across the landing. Charles rushed forward, followed by Graves. Miss Marple did not run. She walked steadily after them. At the end of the corridor, a window stood open. The curtains were blowing in the wind. On the floor beneath the window lay Mrs. Harcourt's dark blue scarf. She had disappeared from the house, but she had not left through the front door. Someone had entered through the window, or someone had left that way. Miss Marple bent slightly and looked at the wet stone outside. There were footprints in the mud. One set led away from the house, another set led toward it. She examined them quietly. Then she noticed something else. One footprint had a distinctive curved mark across the heel. Miss Marple had seen that mark before. She had seen it yesterday afternoon on the lawn, on the shoe of a person who had claimed never to have gone near the rose arbor. She straightened slowly. The mystery was changing shape. Edward Ashcombe had been killed because of something that happened 24 years ago. Mrs. Harcourt had disappeared because she feared something had finally come to light. Evelyn was hiding information. Charles had his own secret, and now a dead woman's name had returned from the past. But Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous clue was often the one that appeared to solve too much. The blood-stained handkerchief, the hidden photograph, the mysterious footprints, each seemed to point toward an answer. Yet none explained one simple question. Why had the murderer chosen the rose arbor? Miss Marple looked through the open window toward the garden. The rain had washed the roses clean, but beneath the oldest part of the arbor, where the wooden posts disappeared into the earth, something small and metallic caught the pale morning light. She did not tell Inspector Graves, not yet. She merely looked at it and smiled faintly. The murderer had hidden something beneath the roses, and whatever it was, Miss Marple suspected, had been waiting there for 24 years. Miss Marple did not immediately tell Inspector Graves what she had seen beneath the rose arbor. There were moments when information was most useful precisely because it remained undisclosed. She had learned this during the long years of observing people in St. Mary Mead, where a careless remark could travel from one end of the village to the other before luncheon and return by tea time, transformed into something almost unrecognizable. She therefore stood quietly at the upstairs window, watching the rain strike the garden, while Inspector Graves and Sergeant Carter examined the muddy footprints outside. Charles Harcourt was still standing near the open window, staring at the ground with an expression of confusion. "Could someone have climbed through here?" he asked. "Possibly," Graves replied, "but these footprints are fresh." Charles looked toward the garden. "Then whoever came through the window was here recently?" "Yes, and my aunt. We don't know yet." Charles turned toward Miss Marple. "You think she was taken?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that we should be careful about assuming Mrs. Harcourt was taken." Charles frowned. "She disappeared." "That is true. Then what else could it mean? She may have gone somewhere willingly, in the middle of a storm. People do surprising things when they are frightened." Charles stared at her. "My aunt was frightened of something." "Yes, you know what it was." Miss Marple looked at him. "I know she was frightened. That is not the same thing." Charles lowered his voice. "She was frightened of Edward Ashcombe, perhaps, and now he's dead." "Yes. Doesn't that tell you something?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It tells me that Edward Ashcombe was dangerous to someone." Graves, who had been examining the footprints, turned toward them. "Miss Marple, you said something earlier about the rose arbor." "Yes. What?" She looked toward the garden. "I think we should examine it again." Within minutes, they were standing beneath the arbor. The rain had eased, leaving droplets suspended from the roses like tiny pieces of glass. The police had already searched the area thoroughly, but Miss Marple knew that searching and observing were not always the same thing. Graves moved carefully around the wooden bench. "Where did you see it?" Miss Marple pointed toward the oldest post. A small metallic object was partially buried beneath the soil. Carter knelt and cleared away the wet earth with a gloved hand. He uncovered a narrow brass container, no larger than a cigarette case. Unlike the key found earlier, this object showed signs of having been buried for many years. Its surface was green with age, and a thin chain had become tangled around it. Graves examined it. "No obvious lock." "Perhaps it isn't meant to be opened," Carter suggested. Miss Marple looked at the chain. "Everything that is locked is meant to be opened eventually." Graves gave her a sideways glance. "That's rather philosophical." "Not at all, merely practical." Carter carefully opened the container. Inside was a tiny folded photograph and a scrap of paper protected by waxed cloth. Graves unfolded the paper. There were only 3 words. "Ask Clara Bell." Nobody spoke. The name seemed to alter the atmosphere beneath the arbor. Dr. Bell's wife had been dead for several years, yet suddenly she appeared in every corner of the investigation. Graves looked at Miss Marple. "Why would someone bury this here?" "Because they wanted someone to find it eventually. Or they wanted someone to find it now." Miss Marple nodded. "That is also possible." Charles had followed them into the arbor. He looked at the paper. "What does it mean?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "that Clara Bell knew something about Marianne, most likely." Charles stared toward the house. "Then we need to find Dr. Bell." They found him in the library, standing beside the fireplace with both hands resting on the mantel. He looked unusually calm. Too calm, Miss Marple thought. A man who had just learned that his late wife's name had appeared in connection with a murder 24 years after her death should have displayed at least some surprise. Dr. Bell displayed none. "Inspector," he said, "I assume you have more questions." "Several." Graves showed him the photograph. Dr. Bell looked at it for a long time. "Where did you find this?" "At Briarwood." Then you know about Marianne Cole. We know she died in what was called an accident. It was an accident. And Clara, for the first time, Belle's expression changed. What about her? Graves placed the small paper on the desk. This was found beneath the rose arbor. Dr. Bell read the 3 words. His face became pale. Ask Clara Bell. He slowly sat down. Where did you find that? Does it mean something? No. Doctor. Graves's voice hardened. Your wife worked at Briarwood 24 years ago. Yes. She knew Marianne Cole. Yes. She was at the railway station the night Marianne died. Dr. Bell looked toward the window. Yes. Now why didn't she tell the police what she saw? She did. According to the records, her statement was incomplete. Clara was frightened. Of what? Dr. Bell closed his eyes briefly. Of Henry Harcourt. Charles stepped forward. My uncle. Bell nodded. He was a powerful man. He had money, influence, friends in the police, friends in London. Clara believed he could ruin her life. Why? Graves asked. Because she knew he had been at the station. Doing what? Bell looked at Miss Marple, arguing with Marianne. Miss Marple remained silent. What were they arguing about? Graves demanded. Money, Charles whispered. The missing money. Bell nodded. Henry Harcourt had been moving money from several accounts. Marianne discovered it. How much? I never knew the exact amount. And Edward Ashcombe, he knew about it too. Then why did Marianne die? Bell's face tightened. Because she threatened to expose Henry. Charles stared at him. You're saying my uncle killed her? No. Bell shook his head. I am saying Henry was afraid she would. Graves leaned closer. Who was at the station that night? Bell hesitated. Henry, Marianne, Edward, Clara. Anyone else? Bell looked down. Lavinia. The room became silent. Charles stared at him. My aunt was there. Yes. Why? She followed Henry. Did she see Marianne? Yes. Did she see what happened? Bell looked toward the window. That is what Clara believed. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And what did Clara tell you? She said Marianne was not alone when she fell. Graves immediately asked, who was with her? Bell shook his head. Clara never said. But she knew. She believed she knew. Who? Bell looked at Miss Marple. Lavinia. Charles stepped backward. No. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Why would your aunt have killed Marianne? She wouldn't. Did you know her 24 years ago? I was young. Were you here? No. Then you cannot say what she would or would not have done. Charles looked angry. You don't know her. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said. But human nature is remarkably consistent. Dr. Bell stood suddenly. You are wasting your time. Graves looked at him. Why? Because Clara was wrong. How do you know? Because Lavinia did not kill Marianne. Miss Marple studied him. You sound very certain. I am. Why? Dr. Bell hesitated. Because I know what happened. Graves stepped closer. Then tell us. Bell's face hardened. I cannot. Cannot or will not. Both. He turned away. Miss Marple noticed that his right hand was trembling. It was not fear. It was anger. But anger at whom? The dead? The living? Or himself? Later that afternoon, the police located Mrs. Harcourt. She had not been kidnapped. She had been found at St. Mary Mead Church, sitting alone on a bench in the empty chapel. When Graves approached her, she looked exhausted. I needed somewhere quiet, she said. Why did you leave Briarwood? Because I couldn't stay there. Were you frightened? Yes. Of whom? Mrs. Harcourt looked toward the stained glass window. Edward. He's dead. I know. Then why are you still afraid? She closed her eyes. Because death doesn't always end a threat. Graves sat beside her. What did Edward know? Everything. About Marianne? Mrs. Harcourt said nothing. About the missing money? Still nothing. About Henry? Her expression changed. Leave my husband out of this. He's been dead for 20 years. That doesn't matter. Miss Marple, who had followed them into the church, stood quietly near the doorway. Mrs. Harcourt noticed her. You knew, she whispered. Miss Marple shook her head. I suspected. You always did see too much. Sometimes. Mrs. Harcourt looked down at her hands. Edward came back because he wanted something. What? Graves asked. Money. How much? Everything Henry had taken. Where was it? Mrs. Harcourt stared at the floor. I don't know. You expect us to believe that? I never knew where Henry kept it. Miss Marple spoke softly, but Edward did. Mrs. Harcourt looked at her. Yes. And Marianne? She knew too. So the missing money survived all these years. Perhaps. And Edward came back for it. Mrs. Harcourt nodded. He said he would expose everything if I didn't help him. Graves leaned forward. Did you agree? No. Did you threaten him? Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flashed. I told him to leave St. Mary Mead. Did he? No. Did you meet him yesterday? She hesitated. Yes. Where? Here. When? Before the tea. What happened? Mrs. Harcourt closed her eyes. We argued. Did you kill him? No. Did you see him after the argument? No. Miss Marple watched her closely. There was something wrong with the answer. Not the words, the timing. Harcourt had answered too quickly when asked whether she killed Edward, but when asked whether she saw him afterward, she had hesitated. That hesitation mattered. What did Edward say during the argument? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Harcourt looked at her. He said something I had not heard in 24 years. What? He said. She knows. Who? Mrs. Harcourt's face became white. I don't know. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on her. But you do. Mrs. Harcourt looked away. I cannot tell you. Because you're protecting someone? Because I'm afraid. Graves stood. Mrs. Harcourt, if you know who killed Edward Ashcombe, you need to tell us. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she whispered, I don't know who killed him. Miss Marple believed her. At least, she believed that particular sentence. Mrs. Harcourt might not know who had killed Edward, but she knew something else, something far more dangerous. She knew who had been at the railway station 24 years ago. She knew what Marianne had seen, and she knew that Edward Ashcombe had returned to St. Mary Mead carrying a secret that could destroy more than one life. That evening, Miss Marple returned home alone. She placed her knitting basket on the table and made herself a cup of tea. Before sitting down, however, she removed a small notebook from a drawer. On one page she wrote 4 names: Henry Harcourt, Marianne Cole, Edward Ashcombe, Clara Bell. Beneath them she wrote a 5th, Lavinia Harcourt. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added a 6th, Dr. Adrian Bell. She stared at the list. There were 6 people connected to a death 24 years ago. 2 were dead. 1 had disappeared. 1 had become a respectable widow. 1 was a doctor. And 1 had never stopped being afraid. Miss Marple closed the notebook. The mystery was no longer merely about Edward Ashcombe's murder. It was about a secret that had survived for 24 years and had now begun killing people again. Yet one detail continued to trouble her. Edward had been carrying money. The money was missing. The letter was missing. Mrs. Harcourt had disappeared and returned. A hidden photograph had surfaced. A blood-stained handkerchief had appeared in a locked suitcase. Every clue seemed designed to lead the police toward one particular conclusion. Someone was carefully arranging the evidence. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Ah, she murmured. Now that is the real mistake. Because a murderer who wanted to escape suspicion would hide evidence. A murderer who wanted someone else suspected would plant evidence. But a murderer who wanted to control the entire investigation would do something much cleverer. They would give the investigators exactly what they expected to find. And somewhere in Briarwood House, Miss Marple was certain there was one final clue that had not yet been discovered. A clue so ordinary that everyone had already looked at it. Everyone except the person who understood why it mattered. The name of Clara Bell remained in Miss Marple's thoughts long after she had returned home that evening. For there was something about the dead woman's place in the story that did not fit comfortably with the other pieces. Clara had been present at the railway station 24 years ago, had known Marianne Cole, had apparently seen something important, and had then remained silent for the rest of her life. Yet silence itself could mean many things. Sometimes people remained silent because they were guilty, sometimes because they were afraid, and sometimes because they believed that telling the truth would hurt someone they loved. Miss Marple had always considered the third sort the most difficult to understand, because such people could perform extraordinary acts of deception while believing themselves perfectly virtuous. The following morning she returned to Briarwood House. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained low and gray, and the garden was covered with shining drops of water. The roses beneath the arbor looked bruised and exhausted. A police constable stood near the entrance, and another was stationed at the rear of the property. Inspector Graves met Miss Marple in the hall. "We've found Mrs. Harcourt's car," he said. "Where?" "At the old railway station." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "The same station where Marianne Cole died?" "Yes. That seems rather deliberate, or convenient." "Indeed." Graves handed her a photograph. The car stood beside the deserted platform, its windscreen wet with rain. "Was Mrs. Harcourt inside?" "No. The car was empty. Then she may have gone there herself." "Possibly. Why?" Graves looked tired. "That is what we're trying to discover." Miss Marple glanced at the photograph again. "When was the car found?" "Just before dawn." "And when did Mrs. Harcourt leave Briarwood?" "Sometime after midnight. So she drove there during the night, apparently. Did she leave anything behind?" "Only this." Graves produced a second evidence bag. Inside was a small envelope. It was tucked beneath the driver's seat. Miss Marple examined it. The envelope had no name. It contained a single handwritten sentence. "Clara knew the truth, but she never told it." Miss Marple was silent. "That was found in the car?" she asked. "Yes. Whoever wrote it expected us to find it. That's what I think." Graves looked toward the hallway. "And that brings us to another problem. Dr. Bell." "Yes." He lowered his voice. "He left the village this morning." "Left. His car is gone." "We don't know where he went." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Did he say anything?" "Only that he had a patient to visit outside the village." "Does he have such patients?" "Yes." "Then perhaps he is telling the truth." Graves sighed. "You always leave me with more possibilities than answers. Answers are often much less useful until one knows which questions to ask." They walked toward the library. On the desk lay several old documents. Graves had apparently spent most of the night examining records concerning Henry Harcourt and Marianne Cole. "We found something in the financial records," he said. "Money disappeared from one of Henry Harcourt's accounts exactly 3 days before Marianne died." "How much?" "A substantial amount." "And where did it go?" "We don't know." "Was Edward Ashcombe involved?" "Possibly. He worked for the firm handling some of Harcourt's investments." Miss Marple looked at the documents. "Then perhaps Ashcombe knew more than he admitted. He certainly knew enough to frighten Mrs. Harcourt, or someone wanted her to believe that he did." Graves frowned. "You keep returning to that possibility." "Because the evidence is unusually theatrical." "Theatrical?" "The bloodied handkerchief, the hidden photograph, the note, Mrs. Harcourt's disappearance, the car at the railway station. Someone is leaving a trail." "You think the murderer is deliberately directing us?" "Yes." "Toward whom?" Miss Marple looked at him. "That's the important question." They were interrupted by Sergeant Carter, who entered carrying a cardboard box. "Inspector, we found these in the attic." Graves looked inside. "What are they?" "Old personal effects belonging to Henry Harcourt." Miss Marple leaned closer. There were letters, account books, photographs, and a small leather diary. Graves opened the diary carefully. Most pages were blank. Several entries had been torn out. "Convenient," he muttered. Miss Marple touched one of the remaining pages with her eyes rather than her hands. "Look at the dates." Graves did. The final intact entry was dated 2 days before Marianne's death. It contained only one sentence. "Lavinia has spoken to her." Miss Marple became very still. "Who is her?" Graves asked. "Marianne, presumably." "What did Lavinia say to her?" "We don't know." "And why was Henry writing it down?" Miss Marple looked at the torn pages, perhaps because he expected something to happen. A knock came at the door. Evelyn Price entered. She looked frightened. "Inspector?" Graves turned. "Yes? I found something." She held out a small key. Where did you get that? In Mrs. Harcourt's bedroom. Graves took it. What does it open? I don't know. Miss Marple studied Evelyn's face. Why were you in Mrs. Harcourt's bedroom? Evelyn hesitated. I was looking for her. After she disappeared? Yes, and you found this? Under the carpet. Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. You understand that searching a room without permission is not ideal. I know. Did you find anything else? Evelyn shook her head. Only the key. Miss Marple looked at it. It was smaller than the brass key found in the gardener's shed and had a distinctive black ribbon attached. She had seen that ribbon before, not on Mrs. Harcourt, on Clara Bell, in the old photograph. Where did you see this? Evelyn asked. On a photograph. Which photograph? The one from the railway station. Evelyn's face changed. Then it belonged to Clara. Miss Marple looked at her sharply. How do you know? Evelyn swallowed. Because I found one just like it in the old files. Graves leaned forward. What old files? Clara Bell's employment records. Where are they? In the attic. Graves immediately sent Carter to retrieve them. 20 minutes later, the file was placed on the desk. Inside was a faded employment photograph of Clara Bell as a young woman. Around her neck hung the same black ribbon. Attached to it was a small key. Miss Marple looked at the photograph for a long moment. What did the key open? Graves asked. Evelyn shook her head. The record doesn't say. Miss Marple smiled. Perhaps it was never recorded because it was not a key to the house. What else could it be? Charles asked, entering unexpectedly. A box, Miss Marple replied. A drawer, a desk, a private compartment. Charles looked uneasy. My uncle had a locked writing desk. Graves turned toward him. Where is it? I don't know. You don't know? It disappeared after his death. Who had access to it? My aunt. Miss Marple looked at Charles. And Clara? Charles frowned. Why would she? Because she may have had something to hide. Charles stared at the key. Then perhaps she kept something there. Something Henry did not want anyone to find. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. That afternoon, Dr. Bell returned to Briarwood. He looked exhausted and considerably older than he had the previous day. Graves met him at the entrance. Where have you been? Visiting a patient. Which patient? Mrs. Palmer. She confirms that? You may ask her. Graves stepped aside. We need to talk about Clara, Doctor. Bell's face tightened. What about her? Miss Marple approached. Her key has been found. Dr. Bell looked at her. What key? The one she wore around her neck. How do you know she wore one? Because there is a photograph. I haven't seen that photograph. Perhaps you should. Miss Marple showed it to him. Dr. Bell stared at the image, his lips parted slightly. Where did you get this? From the attic. Who else has seen it? Inspector Graves, Sergeant Carter, Miss Price, Charles. Dr. Bell looked away. Then it is too late. For what? He did not answer. Graves stepped closer. What did Clara hide? Dr. Bell's voice became quiet. She kept a diary. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Where? I don't know. You must know something. She destroyed it. Did she? She burned most of it. Most? Miss Marple asked. Dr. Bell hesitated. 1 page remained. Where is it? I don't know. What did it say? He closed his eyes. It named the person who pushed Mary Ann. The room went completely silent. Graves's voice became low. Who? Dr. Bell looked toward the window. Clara never told me. You said the page named the person. Ah, it did. Then you read it. Yes. Who did it name? Dr. Bell's expression was one of profound misery. I cannot tell you. Graves stepped forward angrily. A man is dead. Another person may be in danger. And you are protecting someone? Dr. Bell shook his head. You don't understand. Miss Marple spoke quietly. Then help us understand. Dr. Bell looked at her for a long moment. Clara loved someone who was involved. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Henry? No. Edward? Dr. Bell said nothing. Then who? Dr. Bell looked toward the staircase. Someone you have not suspected. That evening, Miss Marple asked Inspector Graves to accompany her to the old railway station. The station had been closed for several years, and the platform was almost completely deserted. Weeds grew between the tracks, and the old station clock had stopped at 11 minutes past 9. Miss Marple stood beneath it. "What time did Marianne die?" she asked. "The official report says around 9:15. And the clock stopped at 9:11. Graves looked up. Perhaps it simply stopped. Perhaps. Miss Marple walked slowly along the platform. Where was Marianne found? Near the far end. And Clara? Here. Graves pointed toward the station entrance. Edward, near the ticket office. Henry, beside the carriage entrance. Miss Marple looked around. Then there was another person. Graves looked puzzled. Why? Because Clara's statement mentioned footsteps behind her. I don't remember that. It was in the original file. Graves opened his notebook. You read it. This morning. He stared at her. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to see the station first. She walked toward the old ticket office. If Marianne fell at 9:15, then the person who pushed her had only a few minutes to leave before the train arrived. There was no train at 9:15. Exactly. Graves frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple pointed toward the rails. Look at the mud. There were old grooves beside the platform edge. A service trolley. So? Someone could have used it. Graves stared. To leave unnoticed. Yes, but who? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Someone who knew the station. They searched the abandoned ticket office. Behind an old cabinet they found a narrow compartment built into the wall. The black ribboned key fitted its lock. Inside was a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. Graves opened it. There was a wedding ring, a train ticket dated 24 years earlier, and a letter. The letter was badly faded, but one sentence remained legible. If anything happens to Marianne, ask the woman who wore the blue gloves. Graves looked at Miss Marple. Blue gloves. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A woman. Do we know who wore them? Not yet. Could it be Lavinia? Perhaps. Clara? Perhaps. Someone else. Miss Marple looked toward the dark railway tracks. Almost certainly. On the journey back to Briarwood, Miss Marple said very little. She was thinking about the photograph, the key, the letter, and the blue gloves. Then she remembered something from the garden party. One of the guests had worn blue gloves despite the warm afternoon. Miss Marple had thought it peculiar at the time. Now she understood why. But there was a greater question. If that woman had been present 24 years ago, why had she returned to Briarwood yesterday? Miss Marple closed her eyes. The answer was beginning to form. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to make her uneasy. The murderer had not simply revived an old secret. The murderer had recreated it. The same people, the same location, the same hidden evidence, and the same deliberate confusion. Someone wanted the present murder to look like a consequence of the past. Yet Miss Marple was beginning to suspect the opposite. The past had been used to conceal something that had happened only yesterday. And if she was right, the person responsible for Edward Ashcombe's death had not needed to know everything about the old tragedy. They had only needed to know what everyone else believed about it. That was the true advantage of a well-kept secret. It did not have to be true anymore. It merely had to be believed. By the following afternoon, Briarwood House had become a place where every innocent movement seemed to carry a hidden meaning. The servants spoke only when necessary. The remaining guests had either returned home or found excuses to remain in their rooms, and even the sound of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall appeared strangely loud. Inspector Graves had ordered that nobody connected with the investigation should leave the village without informing the police, though he knew perfectly well that such instructions did little to prevent people from disappearing if they were determined to do so. Miss Marple, sitting in the library beside the window, watched the garden while pretending to read an old magazine. Her attention was not really on the printed words. She was thinking about the woman in blue gloves. She had seen those gloves yesterday. She remembered them clearly now. They had belonged to Mrs. Penelope Ashby, one of the guests at the garden party, a quiet widow who had spent most of the afternoon discussing roses with the other ladies. At the time, Miss Marple had thought nothing of the gloves except that they were an odd choice for a warm summer afternoon. But memory, once given the right question, could become remarkably precise. Mrs. Ashby had worn pale blue gloves to the garden party. She had removed them only once, when she drank tea. She had then replaced them immediately. Miss Marple remembered another detail. Mrs. Ashby had been standing near the rose arbor shortly before Edward Ashcombe's body was discovered. Inspector Graves entered the library carrying a folder. "You were right," he said, "about Mrs. Ashby." Miss Marple looked up. "Was I?" "She was at the railway station 24 years ago." Miss Marple closed the magazine. "How do you know?" "Her name appears in the old witness statements. Penelope Whitmore at the time. She was waiting for a train." "Did she give evidence?" "No." "Why not?" Graves placed the folder on the table. "She claimed she left before anything happened." "Did she?" "Apparently not." Miss Marple opened the folder. The statement was short. Penelope Whitmore had said she arrived at the station shortly after 8:30 and left at approximately 9. She claimed she had not seen Marian Cole. Miss Marple read it twice. "She lied." Graves nodded. "I think so." "Why?" "Because another witness saw her there at 9:20, after Marian's death." "Yes." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "And where did she go afterward?" "Nobody knows." "Then perhaps she saw more than she admitted." Graves sat down. "There is something else." He removed another photograph. It showed a group of people outside the station on the night Marian died. Miss Marple recognized Henry Harcourt, Edward Ashcombe, Clara Bell, and Penelope Whitmore. But there was one additional person. A young Lavinia Harcourt stood near the platform. She was wearing dark clothing and holding a pair of gloves. "Blue?" Miss Marple asked. Graves nodded. "The photograph is faded, but they appear to be light blue." Miss Marple looked closely. "Then perhaps Mrs. Ashby wasn't the only woman wearing blue gloves." "Exactly." Graves leaned forward. "We found another photograph in the station compartment." "The one with the letter?" "Yes. Look at the corner." Miss Marple examined it. A woman's hand was visible beside the railway bench. She wore a blue glove. Could this be Lavinia? Possibly. And Penelope? Also possible. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then someone has given us 2 suspects instead of 1. Graves sighed. "Which is exactly what I don't need." "Perhaps it is exactly what someone wants." He looked at her. "You think the blue gloves are being used as a distraction?" "I think someone knew we would find that letter." "Why?" "Because it was placed in a locked compartment, with the key hidden in a bedroom." "So?" "Because that is not how someone hides evidence. It is how someone stages a discovery." Graves leaned back. "You believe the murderer is deliberately constructing a story?" "Yes. But why?" "To make us believe Edward was killed because of Marianne, wasn't he?" "Perhaps. You don't think so?" "I think Edward's past explains why someone might have wanted him frightened. It does not necessarily explain why he was murdered yesterday." Graves was silent. "Then what does?" Miss Marple looked out toward the garden. "Something Edward discovered recently." "About whom?" "That is what we must find out." Before Graves could answer, the library door opened. Mrs. Ashby entered. She was wearing a dark green dress and carrying no gloves. Her face was composed, but Miss Marple noticed that she held her handbag unusually tightly. "Inspector," she said, "I was told you wanted to see me." "Yes, Mrs. Ashby. Please sit down." She glanced at Miss Marple before taking the chair. "I understand you have been asking about the old railway incident." "We have. I don't see why that has anything to do with Edward's death." "Perhaps it doesn't." Mrs. Ashby's eyes narrowed. "Then why am I being questioned?" Miss Marple answered gently. "Because you were at the railway station 24 years ago." The woman went still. "Who told you?" "The records. I gave a statement, a very brief one. There was nothing else to say." Miss Marple studied her. "You wore blue gloves that evening." Mrs. Ashby looked down at her hands. "Many women wore gloves. Not many wore them to a railway station in July." A faint smile appeared on Miss Marple's face. "I remember such details." Mrs. Ashby looked toward Graves. "What exactly do you want from me?" "No, the truth. After 24 years, truth doesn't become less important with age." Mrs. Ashby sighed. "I saw Marianne." "When?" "Before she died." "Was she alone?" Mrs. Ashby hesitated. "No." Graves leaned forward. "Who was with her?" "Lavinia." Miss Marple's expression did not change. And Henry, he was nearby. Edward, yes. Clara. Mrs. Ashby looked frightened. Yes. Then you saw all four of them. Yes. What happened? Mrs. Ashby closed her eyes. They argued. About money? About a letter. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. What letter? Marianne had written something. She threatened to send it to the authorities. What did it concern? Henry Harcourt and Lavinia. She begged Marianne not to send it. Why? Mrs. Ashby shook her head. I don't know. Miss Marple watched her. You do. Mrs. Ashby looked away. Lavinia loved Henry. Graves frowned. She was his wife. Not then. The room fell silent. What do you mean? Graves asked. They weren't married when Marianne died. Miss Marple looked at her carefully. Then perhaps Marianne knew something about their relationship. She knew everything. And Edward. Edward was trying to help her. Was he? Mrs. Ashby hesitated. At first. And later. He wanted something in return. Money? Yes. The missing money? Perhaps. Mrs. Ashby looked exhausted. I don't know. Graves leaned closer. What happened to Marianne? Mrs. Ashby began trembling. She fell. Accidentally? I don't know. You were there. I saw her arguing with Lavinia. Then what? Henry arrived. And there was shouting. Who pushed her? Mrs. Ashby closed her eyes. I never saw. But someone did. Yes. Who? She opened her eyes and looked directly at Miss Marple. Clara. Miss Marple said nothing. Clara saw it, Mrs. Ashby continued. She told me afterward. What did she say? She said Lavinia pushed Marianne. Graves stood abruptly. Then why did Clara never accuse her? Mrs. Ashby shook her head. Because Clara loved her. Lavinia? No. Mrs. Ashby looked at Miss Marple. She loved Henry. Miss Marple felt the pieces shift again. Clara had loved Henry, or perhaps Clara had loved someone else. Doctor. Bell had said Clara loved someone involved. Now Mrs. Ashby was saying Clara had protected Lavinia because she loved Henry, but something still did not fit. If Lavinia had pushed Marianne, why had Henry written that Lavinia had spoken to her? Why had Edward returned 24 years later? And why had someone killed Edward now? Mrs. Ashby, Miss Marple said softly, when did you last see Edward Ashcombe? The woman hesitated. Yesterday. Graves looked surprised. Where? Near the Arbor. What did you say to him? Nothing. Did he speak to you? He asked whether I remembered the railway station. And what did you say? Mrs. Ashby looked down. I told him I remembered nothing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Another lie. Mrs. Ashby's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid. Of Edward. Of what he wanted. What did he want? Homtathan the letter. Which letter? The one Marianne wrote. Miss Marple leaned forward. Where is it? Mrs. Ashby stared at her. I don't know. But Edward believed you did. Yes. Did you have it? Silence. Mrs. Ashby. She finally whispered, no. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Who did? The woman looked toward the door. Lavinia. Graves immediately stood. Mrs. Harcourt had Marianne's letter. Yes. Where is it now? I don't know. Are you certain? Yes. Then why did Edward think you had it? Mrs. Ashby looked at Miss Marple. Because I lied 24 years ago. About what? I told everyone I left the station before Marianne died. Miss Marple nodded. But you stayed. Yes. And you saw something. Yes. What? Mrs. Ashby began crying quietly. I saw someone leave the platform. Who? I don't know. Man or woman? Woman. Wearing blue gloves. Mrs. Ashby nodded. Yes. Was it Lavinia? Mrs. Ashby hesitated. I thought so, but you aren't certain. No. Why? Because the woman walked differently. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Differently. She was limping. The room became silent. Did Lavinia limp? Graves asked. No. Then who did? Mrs. Ashby whispered. Clara Bell. Miss Marple sat very still. The entire story had shifted again. If Clara had been the woman in blue gloves, then the letter had been written by Marianne. The witness had been Clara, and the person who left the station might not have been Lavinia at all. Yet Clara was dead. She could not have killed Edward. Unless someone had been using Clara's identity to create a false trail. Miss Marple suddenly remembered the black ribbon around the key. She remembered the old photograph. She remembered Dr. Bell's hesitation. "Mrs. Ashby," she asked quietly, "did Clara limp?" The woman shook her head. "Not normally." "Then why did you say the woman limped?" "Because she was injured." "When?" "After Marianne fell." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Someone attacked Clara." "I don't know." "You saw her." "Only from a distance." "Where did she go?" "Toward the old goods shed." Graves looked at Miss Marple. "The shed is still there." Miss Marple rose. "Then I think we should visit it." They found the old goods shed locked, but the door showed signs of recent use. Inside, dust covered the floor except for a narrow trail leading toward the back wall. Behind a stack of wooden crates, Graves discovered a small wooden box. It was empty except for a pair of faded blue gloves. Miss Marple looked at them. "These belong to Clara." Graves stared. "How do you know?" "Because the stitching on the left cuff is distinctive, and because of the photograph." Miss Marple nodded. She picked up neither glove nor box. "Someone wanted us to find these." Again. "Yes, so Clara was here 24 years ago, but someone brought these here recently." Miss Marple looked at the dust around the box. "No, the box has been here a long time." Graves frowned. "Then perhaps the murderer found it. Perhaps." Miss Marple examined the floor. One of the blue gloves had a small dark stain near the thumb. It was old, almost black. "Blood?" Graves asked. "Possibly. Clara's? We don't know. Then what does it prove?" Miss Marple looked toward the doorway. "That Clara may have been injured the night Marianne died." Graves' face tightened. "And if she was injured, then she may not have been merely a witness. She could have been involved." "Yes." On the way back to Briarwood, Miss Marple remained silent. She had begun to understand why the murderer had constructed such a complicated trail. The old tragedy was not simply background. It was the foundation upon which the present crime had been built. Someone knew that the village remembered Marianne Cole as a young woman who had died in an accident. Someone knew that Edward Ashcombe had carried guilt about that night. Someone knew that Mrs. Harcourt feared the past. Someone also knew that Clara Bell had left behind evidence, but the murderer had made one mistake. They had assumed that Miss Marple would be interested only in what the clues appeared to say. She was far more interested in why the clues had been placed where they were found. When they returned to Briarwood, Miss Marple noticed a woman standing at the far end of the garden. For one brief second, she thought it was Mrs. Harcourt. Then the figure turned away and disappeared behind the trees. Miss Marple walked toward the arbor. Beneath the roses, the earth had been disturbed again. Someone had been digging. She crouched and examined the fresh soil. There was no object there, only a small fragment of blue thread. She picked it up carefully. The thread matched the gloves, but it also matched something else. The dress worn by Mrs. Ashby at the garden party. Miss Marple stood slowly. Two women, two sets of blue gloves, one old secret, one dead man, and a murderer who had gone to extraordinary lengths to make the past appear responsible for the present. Miss Marple looked toward the house. "My dear," she murmured, though no one was there to hear her, "you have made one rather serious mistake." She knew now that the murderer had not merely planted clues. They had borrowed someone else's history. And once she discovered whose history had been borrowed, the path to the truth would become much shorter. The fragment of blue thread remained in Miss Marple's mind throughout the evening, not because it was particularly important in itself, but because it represented precisely the sort of insignificant detail that people ignored when they were concentrating upon larger and more dramatic clues. A blood-stained handkerchief, a hidden letter, an abandoned car, a photograph from 24 years earlier. These things demanded attention. A thread did not. Yet Miss Marple had always believed that the smallest things were often the most honest. People could arrange letters, hide photographs, move bodies, and invent elaborate stories, but they rarely thought about the tiny traces left behind by ordinary movement. She sat in the drawing room at Briarwood House, while Inspector Graves stood near the fireplace, reading through the latest police report. Mrs. Ashby had been allowed to return to her room, though a constable remained outside the house. Dr. Bell had been instructed not to leave the village again. Charles Harcourt had disappeared into the library, where he claimed to be studying his uncle's financial records. Evelyn Price had gone upstairs. The house was quiet, too quiet. "You said the thread came from Mrs. Ashby's dress," Graves said. Miss Marple looked toward him. "It appears to. And the gloves belonged to Clara Bell." "Yes. So what does that tell us? That someone wanted us to connect Mrs. Ashby with Clara. But why? Because the murderer wants us to believe that the same woman was involved in both events." Graves frowned. "You think Mrs. Ashby is being framed?" "Perhaps. For Edward's murder? Perhaps not directly. Then what?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A person can be framed without being accused of murder. Sometimes it is enough to make people doubt their own memories." Graves looked at her thoughtfully. "You believe someone is manipulating witnesses?" "Yes. Mrs. Ashby lied about the railway station." "She did. She also lied about seeing Edward yesterday." "Yes. That makes her look guilty. It makes her frightened." "What's the difference?" "Guilt usually makes people protect themselves. Fear makes them protect someone else." Graves was silent. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. "There is another question." "What?" "Why did Mrs. Ashby lie 24 years ago?" "Because she was afraid of Henry Harcourt. That is what she says." "You don't believe her." "I believe she was afraid." "I am not certain that Henry was the reason." Graves sat opposite her. "Who else could she have feared?" Miss Marple glanced toward the doorway. "Clara Bell." "Clara?" "If Clara knew the truth, Mrs. Ashby might have been afraid of what Clara would reveal." "But Clara was the witness. Was she?" Graves stared at her. "You think she lied?" "I think everyone lied." 24 years ago?" "Yes. And yesterday?" "Probably." Graves sighed. "That leaves us with almost nothing. On the contrary, it leaves us with a great deal." "What?" "Patterns." Miss Marple put down her knitting. "Everyone involved has told the truth about one thing and lied about another. That is not coincidence." "Then what is it?" "Protection." Graves looked puzzled. "Each person is protecting a different part of the same secret." Before he could respond, the library door opened. Charles Harcourt entered, holding an old leather folder. "Miss Marple," he said, "I think I found something." Graves immediately stood. "What?" Charles placed the folder on the table. "These belong to my uncle." Inside were several financial documents, receipts, and a letter. The letter had been folded and refolded so many times that the paper had become soft at the edges. Miss Marple examined the handwriting. "Henry Harcourt." Charles nodded. It was addressed to Edward Ashcombe. Graves took the letter. "Why wasn't this in the original files?" "Because it was hidden inside the back of the writing desk." "What does it say?" Graves read silently, then looked up. "This is interesting." He handed it to Miss Marple. The letter was dated 3 days before Marianne Cole's death. Henry wrote that Edward had been asking too many questions about the company's accounts and that Marianne had become dangerously determined. He warned Edward that if he continued investigating, certain information about Edward's own financial dealings would be exposed. Miss Marple looked at Charles. Edward was not merely helping Marianne. No, he was protecting himself. Charles nodded. "There is more." He opened another envelope. Inside was a bank receipt. A large sum of money had been transferred from Henry Harcourt's account to an account registered under the initials. C.B. Graves stared at the document. "Clara Bell." Charles nodded. "That's what I thought." Miss Marple looked at the date. The transfer had occurred 2 days before Marianne's death. "Why would Henry pay Clara?" Graves asked. "Perhaps she knew something. Or perhaps she was being bribed." Miss Marple shook her head. "No. Why not?" "Because the payment was not hidden." Graves frowned. "What do you mean? If Henry wanted to bribe Clara, he would not transfer the money in a way that could be traced." Charles looked surprised. "Then what was it?" "Protection. For Clara. Possibly." Miss Marple looked at the initials again. "Or for someone using her account." Graves leaned forward. "Who?" "That is the question." A sudden knock came at the door. Evelyn entered carrying a tray of tea. She looked at the papers on the table and immediately stopped. Miss Marple noticed the reaction. Would you like to sit down, dear? No. You recognize these documents? Evelyn shook her head. I don't. You do. Evelyn's eyes moved toward Charles. Where did you find them? In my uncle's desk. Then you shouldn't have opened them. Why? Because they were private. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Were you aware of the account belonging to CB? Evelyn went pale. No. Then why are you frightened? I'm not. You are. Evelyn placed the tea tray on the table with trembling hands. I think I should leave. Miss Marple gently touched her arm. Evelyn, what did Clara Bell have to do with Henry Harcourt? Evelyn stared at her. Everything. Graves immediately moved closer. What does that mean? Evelyn whispered. Clara was not his employee. We know she worked here. She was more than that. Charles looked confused. What are you saying? Evelyn took a breath. She was Henry's sister. The room became silent. Graves stared at her. That's impossible. It isn't. Evelyn's voice trembled. She used another surname because Henry wanted nobody to know. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind moved quickly. Then Clara Bell was not merely a witness. No. Evelyn looked down. She knew where the money came from. Why was she working here? To help him. And Marianne discovered it. Yes, Graves asked. Why didn't the records show they were related? Because Henry changed the records. And Edward, he discovered the truth. Then why was Clara afraid? Evelyn swallowed. Because Henry had threatened her. Miss Marple looked toward the window, and after Marianne died, Clara disappeared for several months. Then she married Dr. Bell. Yes. Did Dr. Bell know? Evelyn nodded. He knew everything. Graves sat down slowly. Then why has he lied to us? Evelyn whispered. Because Clara asked him to. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Why? Evelyn looked at her. Because Clara believed Marianne's death was partly her fault. How? She gave Henry information. What information? She told him that Marianne planned to expose him. And then? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Henry went to the station. Miss Marple remained silent. The old story was becoming clearer, but one crucial part was still missing. Who had pushed Marianne? And why had Clara written that someone else had done it? Evelyn, Miss Marple said quietly, you said Clara believed Marianne's death was partly her fault. Yes. Did Clara ever say who pushed Marianne? Evelyn hesitated. She said she knew. Who? She never told me. But you know something. Only what she said before she died. Miss Marple waited. She said the person who pushed Marianne was not the person everyone suspected. Graves leaned forward. Who did everyone suspect? Lavinia. Miss Marple nodded. And Clara said it wasn't her. Yes. Then who? Evelyn shook her head. She never said. Miss Marple looked at the financial documents again. The initials CB had suddenly become more complicated. Clara had access to Henry's money. She had knowledge of Marianne's plans. She had been at the station. She had been injured. She had disappeared afterward. Yet she had also apparently protected someone. Miss Marple began to wonder whether Clara had not been protecting the murderer at all. Perhaps she had been protecting the person who was being blamed. Inspector, she said, we need to speak to Dr. Bell again. They found him in the conservatory. He was staring through the glass at the garden. You know, he said before either of them spoke. Yes, Graves replied. About Clara. Yes. Dr. Bell closed his eyes. Then there is no point denying it. Miss Marple sat beside him. Why did Clara protect Lavinia? He looked at her. She didn't. Miss Marple waited. She protected Henry. Graves's expression hardened. You said she loved someone involved. She loved her brother. Miss Marple nodded. And Marianne. Clara believed Marianne would destroy Henry. Did she want Marianne dead? No. But she gave Henry information. Yes. And Henry went to the station. Yes. What happened there? Dr. Bell looked toward the rain-streaked glass. Henry confronted Marian. Edward arrived. Lavinia arrived. Clara followed. And? There was an argument. Then Marianne fell. Yes. Who pushed her? Doctor. Bell's voice became almost inaudible. Nobody knows. Graves stared at him. You just said Clara knew. She believed she knew. Who did she believe pushed Marianne? Dr. Bell hesitated. Edward. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Edward? Clara saw him near Marian, but Mrs. Ashby said Lavinia. Mrs. Ashby was mistaken. Was she? Dr. Bell looked at Miss Marple. You know what people remember after 24 years? They remember the person they feared most. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Yes, memory is often loyal to emotion rather than fact. Graves asked. Why did Edward return to St. Mary Mead? Because he knew the truth was still hidden. What truth? Dr. Bell looked at him. That Marianne was not killed because of the money. Everyone became still. Then why? Because of a child. Miss Marple's face changed. Whose child? Dr. Bell looked toward the doorway. Nobody was there. He lowered his voice. Henry Harcourt's. Graves stared at him. Marianne was pregnant? Dr. Bell nodded. She intended to tell Lavinia. Miss Marple understood immediately. If Marianne's child had been Henry's, then the entire structure of the past changed. Lavinia had a motive to silence Marianne. Henry had a motive to silence her. Edward had a motive to exploit the secret, and Clara had a motive to protect her brother. But there was another question. If Marianne had been pregnant, what happened to the child? Dr. Bell looked at Miss Marple. The child survived. The words seemed to echo through the conservatory. Where? She asked. I don't know. You do. No. Miss Marple studied him. Then why are you afraid? Dr. Bell stood suddenly. Because Edward Ashcombe knew. Graves moved toward him. Knew what? He knew where the child was. And he told you? No. Then who? Dr. Bell's face had gone pale. He told the child. Silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Then the child is alive. Dr. Bell nodded. And maybe somewhere in this village. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the rose arbor alone. She stood beneath the roses, looking at the place where Edward's body had been found. The murderer had wanted everyone to believe that Edward's death was revenge for Marianne. But perhaps Edward had been killed because he had discovered the identity of Marianne's child. A living secret was more dangerous than a dead one. Miss Marple looked down at the small blue thread still held between her fingers. Then she remembered the dress worn by Mrs. Ashby, the gloves associated with Clara, and the figure she had seen leaving the garden. The thread was not from Mrs. Ashby's dress after all. She was certain now. It had come from the lining of a man's coat. Someone had been standing close to the roses. Someone who had been close enough to Edward before he died. Miss Marple turned toward the house. She knew who had worn such a coat. She had noticed it during the garden party. But she would not yet tell Inspector Graves. There was one final test she needed to make. One small question. One carefully chosen name. And if the person reacted as she expected, the entire mystery would begin to collapse. The following morning, Miss Marple asked Inspector Graves to gather everyone in the drawing room at 11 o'clock. And although Graves had become accustomed to her unusual methods, he still looked doubtful when she explained that she did not intend to accuse anyone. Not yet, she said, arranging a small vase of roses on the table. Accusations are useful only when one is certain. And you are certain? Graves asked. Miss Marple looked at him with a mild expression. I am certain of the person who killed Edward Ashcombe. I am less certain of the precise reason. Graves stared at her. You know who killed him? Yes. Then why not arrest them? Because I want them to tell us why. At 11, Charles Harcourt, Mrs. Penelope Ashby, Dr. Adrian Bell, Evelyn Price, and Lavinia Harcourt gathered in the drawing room. Mrs. Harcourt looked pale but composed. Dr. Bell stood beside the fireplace. Mrs. Ashby sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Charles remained near the door. Evelyn avoided everyone's eyes. Inspector Graves stood beside Miss Marple. I have asked you all here, Miss Marple began, because Edward Ashcombe's death has become confused with an event that happened 24 years ago. That confusion has been useful to someone. Nobody spoke. 24 years ago, Marianne Cole died at the railway station. Everyone remembered that death differently. Some remembered an argument. Some remembered money. Some remembered Henry Harcourt. Some remembered Lavinia. Clara Bell remembered something else. And Edward Ashcombe remembered something else again. Mrs. Harcourt's face tightened. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because the murderer depended upon your memories being imperfect." Miss Marple picked up the old photograph. "Someone wanted us to believe that the murder of Edward was simply an echo of Marianne's death." She placed the photograph on the table. It wasn't. Graves watched the suspects carefully. "Edward discovered something recently," Miss Marple continued. "He discovered that Marianne's child had survived." A sharp intake of breath came from Mrs. Ashby. Charles stared at her. Dr. Bell lowered his eyes. Miss Marple noticed every reaction. That child was the real secret. Marianne had intended to reveal that Henry Harcourt was the father. But before she could do so, she died. Lavinia suddenly spoke. "I didn't kill her." "I know," said Miss Marple. Lavinia stared at her. "You know?" "Yes. You had a motive, but motive is not action." Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Ashby. "You believed you saw Lavinia arguing with Marianne. You later saw a woman leaving the station wearing blue gloves. You assumed it was Lavinia, but the woman was injured and limping." Mrs. Ashby nodded slowly. "Yes, it was Clara Bell." "Doctor." Bell closed his eyes. "Yes." Graves looked at him. "You knew." "Clara told me." Miss Marple nodded. "Clara followed Henry to the station. She saw Marianne confronted. She saw Edward arrive. She saw Lavinia arrive. But she also saw something nobody else understood. Henry was not the person who pushed Marianne." "Then who?" Graves asked. Miss Marple looked at Edward's old photograph. "Marianne fell when she tried to pull away from someone. Nobody deliberately pushed her. At least, not in the way everyone believed." Lavinia looked confused. "Then it was an accident?" "Yes." Miss Marple paused. "But Henry allowed everyone to believe otherwise because the truth was more dangerous." "What truth?" Charles asked. "Marianne's child." Miss Marple looked at Dr. Bell. Henry knew the child was his. He also knew that if Marianne died, the child could eventually inherit part of his estate if the truth became known. Graves frowned. "But Henry was never convicted, because there was no murder." Miss Marple looked at Lavinia, and that is why Lavinia carried guilt for 24 years. She believed her confrontation with Marianne had caused the fall. Lavinia began to cry silently. "I thought she hated me." "She didn't," Miss Marple said. "Marianne was frightened, but she was trying to tell you the truth." Lavinia covered her face. "Then why did Clara lie?" "Because Clara believed protecting Henry was protecting her family. She altered her statement. She allowed people to suspect Lavinia. She hid evidence. She even helped Henry move money," Dr. Bell whispered. "She regretted it until the day she died." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and that is where Edward Ashcombe entered the story again." Graves looked toward her. "Edward discovered the old truth." "Yes, he learned that Marianne's death had been accidental and that Henry had concealed the existence of his child. But Edward did not return merely to expose Henry. He wanted money." Mrs. Ashby looked down. "Yes, he had financial troubles," Miss Marple continued. "He threatened to expose the secret unless someone paid him. Mrs. Ashby knew enough to frighten him, but not enough to satisfy him. Mrs. Harcourt knew more. Dr. Bell knew almost everything. And someone else knew exactly where Edward was looking." Graves asked. "Who?" Miss Marple looked around the room. "The person who killed Edward." Silence filled the room. The murderer understood that Edward's greatest weakness was his greed. They allowed him to believe that the old letter still existed. They allowed him to believe that Marianne's child could be located. They arranged meetings. They fed him fragments of information. Then they brought him to the rose arbor. Charles stared at her. "Who?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "You have already seen the answer." Charles looked confused. "Me? No, Charles." She turned toward Dr. Bell. "The answer is Dr. Bell." The room seemed to freeze. Dr. Bell did not move. Graves's hand immediately went toward his pocket. "Adrian Bell?" Mrs. Ashby whispered. "No." Miss Marple continued calmly. "Dr. Bell killed Edward Ashcombe because Edward had discovered the identity of Marianne's child." Bell's face remained strangely peaceful. "You cannot prove that. I don't need scientific proof." "Then you have nothing." "On the contrary." Miss Marple lifted the fragment of blue thread. This came from your coat. Belle looked at it. Many coats contain blue thread. Not this particular thread. The lining of your old traveling coat had been repaired with blue thread. Sergeant Carter found the same stitching in your wardrobe. Belle said nothing. You were near the Arbor, Graves added. We found traces of your shoes. I went there earlier. Yes, Miss Marple said, but you did not tell us. Belle's expression changed. Miss Marple continued. You also knew about the hidden compartment at the railway station. You knew Clara had left something there. You knew about the black-ribboned key because you had seen it before. You knew about the letter. You knew about Marianne's child. And most importantly, you knew Edward was going to the Arbor. Belle shook his head. You are wrong. Then let me ask one question. Miss Marple turned toward him. Why did you tell us that Clara's diary named the person who pushed Marianne? Belle stared at her. Because Clara told me. No, because you needed us to believe Clara knew who was responsible. She did. She knew something else. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. She knew the child was alive. Belle went completely still, and she knew where the child had been taken. Graves looked at him. Where? Miss Marple looked toward Charles. Charles stared back in confusion. The child was raised under another name, she said. Clara arranged it after Marianne's death. She believed that if Henry discovered the child, he would use the child to protect himself. She therefore gave the child to someone she trusted. Charles suddenly looked pale. Who? Miss Marple looked at him. Your Aunt Lavinia. Lavinia gasped. No. Miss Marple nodded. You raised Marianne's child. Lavinia shook her head violently. I never had children. Not officially. Miss Marple's gaze softened. But you took the baby and raised her as your own ward. Everyone believed she was the daughter of a distant relative. Graves stared at Lavinia. Where is she now? Lavinia looked toward Charles. Then slowly she turned to Evelyn. Evelyn began crying. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Charles stared at Evelyn as though seeing her for the first time. Evelyn covered her mouth. I'm sorry. Charles stepped backward. You're Marianne's daughter? Evelyn nodded through her tears. The room became utterly silent. Miss Marple continued gently. That is why Dr. Bell killed Edward. Edward had discovered Evelyn's identity. He intended to use her existence to blackmail Lavinia and eventually gain access to the Harcourt fortune. Dr. Bell could not allow that. He had spent his entire life protecting Clara's final wish. When Edward threatened Evelyn, Bell decided that the secret had to die with him. Doctor, Bell finally spoke. You don't understand. I do. He would have destroyed her. Perhaps. He had already found the records. Yes. He was going to expose everything. Yes. Then what would you have done? Miss Marple looked at him sadly. I would have told the truth. Bell's eyes filled with tears. You don't know what truth can do to people. Oh, I do, Miss Marple said. Very well. Dr. Bell slowly sat down. I met Edward beneath the arbor. He had the letter. He knew about Evelyn. He wanted money. He said he would expose her. And you killed him. Bell nodded. I struck him with the stone. Graves stepped forward. Then you planted the handkerchief? Yes. The photograph? Yes. The note? Yes. Miss Marple shook her head. Not all of them. Bell looked at her. What? You did not plant every clue. His face changed. What do you mean? Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Ashby. Somebody else tried to use your crime to uncover the truth. Mrs. Ashby looked frightened. No. Yes. Miss Marple smiled gently. You left the blue gloves because you wanted the truth about Clara to be discovered. Mrs. Ashby began to cry. I wanted someone to know. And the letter at the station? Graves asked. Mrs. Ashby placed it there. She nodded. I couldn't destroy it. Miss Marple looked at Dr. Bell. You killed Edward, but you were not responsible for every deception surrounding his death. Bell lowered his head. No. And that is why the investigation became so confusing. Miss Marple turned toward Evelyn. You were the secret everyone was protecting, but you were never the reason Marianne died. You were the reason people continued lying. Evelyn wiped her eyes. I never knew. That was the point. Lavinia approached her slowly. My dear. Evelyn stood. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Then Lavinia embraced her. Charles remained silent. overwhelmed by the revelation that the woman he had known as a family employee was actually his cousin. Inspector Graves placed a hand on Dr. Bell's shoulder. "You will have to come with us." Bell nodded. "I know." As he passed Miss Marple, he stopped. "Was there ever another way?" Miss Marple looked at him sadly. "There is always another way. It is simply not always the easiest." After Dr. Bell was taken away, the house gradually became quiet again. The garden remained wet from the previous night's rain, and the roses beneath the arbor had begun to recover. Miss Marple walked there alone. Graves joined her a few minutes later. "You solved it," he said. "Not entirely. What remains? The oldest mystery. Marianne's death?" "Yes." Miss Marple looked toward the railway line in the distance. "We may never know every detail. Marianne fell. Clara lied. Henry concealed the truth. Lavinia carried guilt. Edward exploited it. Dr. Bell killed to protect the child, and the village remembered everything incorrectly." Graves smiled. "That sounds like enough mystery for one lifetime." "Perhaps." Miss Marple touched one of the roses. "Human beings rarely change, Inspector. They merely find new reasons for doing old things." "And what happens to Evelyn? She will finally know who she is. And Lavinia, she will finally forgive herself." Graves nodded. "What about you?" Miss Marple smiled. "I shall go home and have tea." He laughed softly. "After all this? Especially after all this?" She began walking toward the house, then stopped. "Inspector?" "Yes?" "There is one thing you should remember." "What?" "A murderer may hide a body beneath the roses, but secrets are rather like roses themselves. However deeply they are buried, they have a habit of growing toward the light." And with that, Miss Marple returned to Briarwood House, leaving behind the rose arbor, the old railway station, and the 24-year-old secret that had finally been brought into the open. The village would talk, of course. It would talk for weeks. Some would say Edward Ashcombe deserved his fate. Others would condemn Dr. Bell. Some would pity Lavinia, while others would wonder how such a secret could have survived for so long. But eventually the excitement would fade. The shops would reopen. The church bells would ring. Tea would once again be served in the afternoons. Children would play in the lanes, and beneath the roses, where a corpse had once been hidden, new flowers would bloom. Miss Marple would remember the case not for the violence, nor for the lies, nor even for the murderer, but for the simple lesson it had taught her once again. People could spend 24 years protecting a secret, but they could spend only one moment destroying it. And sometimes, the person who appeared to be protecting the truth was the very person who had been hiding it all along.